Dear friends, welcome to ePathshala. I am Dr. Vishal Jadhav, Department of Sociology, Tilak Maharashtra Vidyapith, Pune. Today we are going to look at a module titled Political Society and the Contestation of Legality, which is part of the Political Sociology paper. In this module, we are going to understand what Partha Chatterjee terms as civil society and political society. According to him, civil society is that sphere of citizens who have normalized and naturalized the normative ideology or the dominant ideology of the ruling class. These are citizens who are urban based and intellectuals or the middle classes. As opposed to this, he terms another sphere who are outside the ambit of the ruling class and who are not part of the naturalized and the hegemonized class called the political class. These are the subaltern groups, especially the urban poor, who are left out of this governance model and left to defend themselves, especially through non-legal ways. Reasons for the rise of political society. Political society for Chatterjee is a domain lying between civil society and the state. It refers to the proliferation of forms of mobilization by underprivileged communities that violate law and are opposed to the civic norms of good citizenship. This is a politics emerging out of the developmental policies of government aimed at specific population groups. He locates the emergence of political society in the Indian context in the 1970s and 80s. Chatterjee argues that many of the sites and activities characteristic of political society can be shown to have emerged within the spectrum of nationalist political mobilization in the colonial period. However, he argues it has taken on something like a distinct form only since the 1980s. He says three conditions have facilitated this process. The first is due to a transition that occurred in modern politics in the course of a 20th century from the conception of democratic politics grounded in the idea of popular sovereignty to one in which democratic politics is shaped by governmentality. Popular sovereignty is the founding premise of modernity, the conception of every individual as a citizen with a bundle of rights. However, especially in the West, there is a whittling down of popular sovereignty in favor of the management of sovereignty. Following Foucault's conception of governmentalization of the state, he argues that in the contemporary regime of power, Enlightenment ideas of citizenship have been substituted by the concept of population, an instrumental notion of costs and benefits. This regime secures legitimacy not by the participation of citizens in matter of state, but by claiming to provide for the well-being of the population. Its mode of reasoning is not deliberative openness, but rather an instrumental notion of costs and benefits. Its apparatus is not the Republican Assembly, but an elaborate network of surveillance through which information is collected on every aspect of the life of the population that is to be looked after. The critical issue, suggests Chatterjee, is that relations of governmentality shape not merely the strategies of states, but also the forms of political demands and community that arise to resist them. Chatterjee notes that one of the major effects of the rise of governmentality logic was the emergence of the distinction between citizens and populations. Citizens inhabit the domain of theory, populations the domain of policy. Unlike the concept of citizen, the concept of population is wholly descriptive and empirical. It does not carry a normative burden. Populations are identifiable, classifiable, and describable, by empirical or behavioral criteria and are amenable to statistical techniques such as census and sample surveys. Unlike the concept of citizen, which carries the ethical connotation of participation in the sovereignty of the state, the concept of population makes available to government functionaries a set of rationally maneuverable instruments for reaching large populations of the inhabitants of a country as the targets of their policies, economic policy, administrative policy, law, and even political mobilization. Here, Chatterjee elaborates on the implications of what Foucault calls the pastoral functions of governmental systems, as governments identify populations that must be classified and cared for. These populations make demands for those benefits even if they are excluded from civil society and in violation of law. The second condition for the rise of political society is the widening of the arena of political mobilization. Chatterjee notes that this is often prompted by electoral consideration and often only for electoral ends. From formally organized structures such as political parties with well-ordered internal constitutions and coherent doctrines and programs to loose and often transient mobilizations building on communication structures that would not be ordinarily recognized as political. For instance, religious assemblies or cultural festivals. The final condition is due to what Chatterjee terms as the return of primitive accumulation, logic of capital in recent times. While corporate capital is dispossessing millions, the dispossessed are neither getting absorbed into industry nor getting socially transformed as they were supposed to through proletarianization. Chatterjee says this floating mass of labor, an enormous but shifting population of potential workers, have instead become a constituent of political society as opposed to civil society. Characteristics of political society. To understand the characteristics of political society and how it differs from the activities of civil society, let us look into some of the case studies which Chatterjee gives us. Using the politics of illegal squatters in the city of Kolkata on public land and their forming of concrete associational forms to resist government action to evict them, Chatterjee gives a picture of how the political society functions in India. The first key feature of political society is that it operates outside of formal politics. Thus, a crucial part of what defines activities in this domain is illegality or non-legality, where the state itself places the law in suspension in order to recognize the claim of the governed. Many of these groups, organized into associations, transgress the strict lines of legality in struggling to live and work. They may live in illegal squatters, settlements, make illegal use of water or electricity, travel without tickets in public transport, but putting pressure on the government to give them benefits often means bending or stretching of rules, that is, laws governing property and squatting, because those rules are the means by which poor, rural and marginalized people are kept from power in the first place. It is through the paralegal and stretched arena of political society only that such groups can expand their power. Secondly, Chatterjee notes that the imaginative world of politics of the governed is driven by notions of community. Political society is the domain of not yet citizens, those who are not modern, individuated citizens in the specific sense this has come to acquire in Western political and social theory. It is a domain where claims of the inhabitants can only be addressed in a language other than that of individual rights. However, Chatterjee cautions that these collective forms cannot be categorized as civic associations, nor are they a replication of kinship organizations, even though they talk in the language of community. What Chatterjee finds unique about the survival strategies of such marginal groups is the way in which the imaginative power of a traditional structure of community, including its fuzziness and capacity to invent relations of kinship, has been wedded to the modern emancipatory rhetoric of autonomy and equal rights. These strategies are not available within the liberal space of the associations of civil society transacting business with the constitutional state. Politics of governed is thus not a throwback to pre-colonial politics, but a result of modern forms of rule or governmentality. The third key feature of the politics of the governed is the representative or mediators who articulate the demands of the community and promise electoral support to the government representatives. These mediators negotiate between who govern and those who are governed. Chatterjee notes that to produce a viable and persuasive politics of the governed, there has to be a considerable act of mediation. He notes that the politics of political society allows popular leaders to take precedence over the law. Finally, Chatterjee notes that because the means of civil society are unavailable to the members of political society, the latter use violence and illegalities strategically. Critique of political society. Firstly, critics have questioned the binaries Chatterjee put forward to explain the emerging democratic politics in post-colonies. These include both the neat division between civil society and political society, and one between modernity and democracy. They argue that while Chatterjee tries to rescuing certain forms of politics from hegemonic interpretations of Western liberal theory, he ends up reinforcing many of the binaries and essential assumptions of the West. Critics point out the difficulty of thinking of the civil and the political in terms of the spatial metaphor, inherited from Western political theory as not working beyond a point. For example, Nivedita Menon asks, can civil society and political society be divided along the lines of the elite, that is the modern, and the popular, that is the domain of transactions and mediations? How does one see, in that case, other illegalities indulged in by the non-poor and overlooked by the state? She proposes that civil and political society are better seen as two distinct modes of engagement with politics, rather than as domains that can be neatly separated. Nissim Manathukarin argues that Chatterjee fails to understand the multifarious ways in which the binary of civil society or political society is being bridged on the ground. He argues that the strategies that Chatterjee describes as part of the political practice of the illegal squatters, the array of connections made outside the community with other disadvantaged groups, privileged groups, employers, government functionaries, political leaders, and so on, also resemble rational, purposive, strategic action in the Habermasian sense. The community itself is built from scratch in a thoroughly secular fashion, and its main goal is to secure autonomy and equal rights. Therefore, it is not clear why Chatterjee privileges the community when other elements are equally present. Many critics have questioned his opposing of democracy and modernity or civil society, regarding the latter as a Western phenomena. Chatterjee famously argued that the framework of democracy, on the other hand, will pronounce modernity itself as inappropriate and deeply flawed. Manathukaran says Chatterjee locates democracy in the popular assertions of the masses, but does not take into account the fact that these struggles also draw upon the ideals of modernity and European Enlightenment and make claims on that basis. This, he argues, drives a wedge between two essentialized categories of the East and the West and ignores the commonalities between the two. For example, the discourse of individual rights, which is increasingly gaining importance in the former. Moreover, these struggles have been to attain and extend citizenship, not to remain as manipulable instruments of political society. Manathukaran says that this eagerness to dismiss any European ideas of modernity as somehow alien to post-colonial consciousness makes it imperative to resurrect a democracy sans civil society and modernity, both apparently European in origin, leading to a whole lot of contradictions. Secondly, critics argue that Chatterjee's critique of civil society is one-sided. Manathukaran concludes that despite the critique of modernity and civil society, the biggest lacuna in post-colonial theories is its inability to propose pathways out of the present. Thirdly, critics also argue that the erosion of popular sovereignty and governmentalization of state are not inevitable. Manathukaran says that while there are inherent characteristics of institutions like the modern state, the authority of the state is not inexorably destined to be the technologies of power as implied by Chatterjee. Nevertheless, the nature of the state is determined by the kind of social forces that are behind it and the state-society relationship that is extant in the society. While Chatterjee's diagnosis that there has been a gradual governmentalization of the state is correct, the reasons adduced for the same and also the remedies prescribed warrant critical re-examination. The initiation of the people's plan by the state in Kerala, Manathukaran argues, is ample evidence of the fact that the nature of the state needs to be determined historically, not essentially. If Kerala shows a different trajectory from other Indian states, it has been precisely because every victory of the working class and the peasantry was institutionalized and made part of the rational legal order. With each successive mobilization and struggle of the rural poor, the state was forced to democratize itself. Many critics have argued that the basis of political society, the pastoral functions of state, have retreated in the onset of neoliberalism. After all, one of the defining characteristics of the state under neoliberalism is its gradual retreat from the provisions of public good and social services, especially those services that might benefit the poor and dispossessed. In the face of this well-known and well-documented fact, when Chatterjee asserts that the state has stepped in to do exactly the opposite, that is, reverse the deleterious consequences of primary accumulation, one is more than surprised. The final criticism is that Chatterjee does not look enough into the problems of the political society. In not casting enough light on the negative aspects of political society, Chatterjee ignores the anti-democratic tendencies within it. Critics of Chatterjee have correctly noted that the concept of political society is very vague. It encompasses both strategic and contextual struggles for survival along with radical political movements without necessarily distinguishing between them. As a result, the concept does not understand that while it is democratic to recognize the strategies for survival, it is struggles that lie beyond survival strategies that are imperative for any meaningful idea of democratization. Manathukaran argues that Chatterjee ignores the negative side of political society, excludes the possibility that political society can be counterproductive to the goal of democratization. It was precisely in the sphere of political society that exploitative factors like the regulative rentier class, the politicians, bureaucrats and village leaders and so on who monopolize public administration grow. He notes that one of the main modes of patronage and corruption is in the selection of beneficiaries for state-sponsored programs and resources, as well as extracting a rent for publicly owned and funded resources. Although political demonstrations and patron-client relationships may bring real benefit to less privileged populations, he still finds political society, the political world of those who are excluded from civil society, inadequate because it fails to give the underprivileged effective agency. Therefore, the welfare benefits that the government policy makers extend at one point may subsequently be withdrawn if the cost-benefit calculations change. Based on the empirical research on the People's Plan campaign in Kerala, one of the most extensive democratic decentralization programs in the world, Manathukaran argues that the extension of popular sovereignty requires that we go beyond political society. Since the marginalized populations who constitute political society are forced on immediate survival, they are negatively placed in fighting for long-term structural transformation. This hinders community and collective interests and gives way to individualized interest-based politics. What the oppressed need is not the permanent insecurity of the machinations of political society, but politics which brings them together with similarly oppressed groups. It also has to be asked how permanent the democratization process engendered by political society are if they are not institutionalized as part of civil society and the state. In his later works, Chatterjee explicitly tries to address issues like violence and patriarchy in political society. Chatterjee recognizes that a local consensus among rival political representatives is likely to reflect the locally dominant interests and values. He says that the political society will bring into the hallways and corridors of power some of the squalor, ugliness, and violence of popular life. It would be effective in securing the demands of those who are able to find organized political support, but could ignore and even suppress demands of locally marginalized interests. Besides, a local political consensus is also likely to be socially conservative and could be particularly insensitive, for instance, to gender or minority issues. However, Chatterjee argues that if one truly values the freedom and equality that democracy promises, then one cannot imprison it within the sanitized fortress of civil society. He also cautions that crime and violence in political society are not fixed, black and white legal categories. They could be open to a great deal of political negotiation. It is a fact, for instance, that in the last 2.5 decades, there has been a distinct rise in the public and political outbreak of caste violence in India, in a period which has seen, without doubt, the most rapid expansion of democratic assertion by the hitherto oppressed castes. We have also numerous examples when violent movements by deprived regional, tribal, or other minority groups have been followed by a quick and often generous inclusion into the ambit of governmentality. There is then a strategic use of legality and violence here on the terrain of political society. Importance of political society. Despite all the above criticism, Chatterjee's concept of political society can be regarded as a momentous intervention in political theory that inscribed the post-colonial, in a generic sense, at the heart of political theory. It was a unique attempt to account for democratic politics in those parts of the world that were not direct participants in the history of the evolution of the institutions of modern capitalist democracy. In much of political theory, democracy and modernity in India and other post-colonial societies always seem to be striving to be like the real thing that exists, apparently only in the West. Thus, as a theoretical intervention, it continues to have a great impact on studying democracy in post-colonies. Subsequently, many ethnographic and historical studies have attempted to reframe important political and theoretical concepts such as civil society, modernity, governance, empire, and globalization. Firstly, Chatterjee's work showed how the paralegal, despite its ambiguous and supplementary status in relationship to the legal, is not some pathological condition of retarded modernity, but rather part of the very process of the historical constitution of modernity in most of the world. That we should not see the activities of the political society as backward forces that modernity will overcome. Earlier, it was argued that if civil society is the domain of modernity, rule of law, and rationality, the question of political society as its negatively constituted other was one where the problem of the irrational erupts in politics. Chatterjee's contribution was to show that in many ways political society was connected with the trajectory of democratization in post-colonies. To rescue a form of democratic politics not based on individual rational actors and civil society forms was not an easy task. After all, one of the big anxieties of 20th century was the rise of Nazism and a whole range of other political mobilizations that defy notions of subjectivity as propounded by the Enlightenment as autonomous, self-willing, rational. What political society concept shows is that what counts as the political needs to be stretched, expanded to include the experiences, knowledge, and political agency of the people traditionally marginalized in political theory. Secondly, Chatterjee's work showed how the functions of governmentality can create conditions not for a contraction but rather an expansion of democratic political participation. He argues that modern political theory, whether liberal, communitarian, republican, or Marxist, fails to take governmentality and by the extension the different senses of community to which it gives birth into account. Chatterjee argues that when there is a successful mobilization of political society to secure the benefits of governmental programs for poor and underprivileged population groups, one could claim that there is an actual expansion of the freedoms of people enabled by political society that would not have been ordinarily possible within civil society. That the actual transactions over the everyday distribution of rights and entitlements can lead over time to substantial redefinitions of property and law within the actual existing modern state. Chatterjee argues that the politics of the governed have transformative effect by expanding the freedoms of marginalized groups, and that is a zone in which the project of democratic modernity has to operate slowly, painfully, unsurely. Thirdly, Chatterjee's work addresses the absence of community in Western paradigm of politics. The biggest lacuna of Western political theory is its ignorance of community in a theorization of civil society and state. In the modern liberal conception of politics, the aim of modernity is to transform traditional social authorities and practices into the modular forms of bourgeoisie civil society. Modernity entails the transformation of traditional community into nation states and subjects into citizens. In particular, attachments that seem to emphasize the inherited, the primordial, the parochial, or the tradition were regarded by most theorists as smacking of conservative and intolerant practices, and hence as inimical to the values of modern citizenship. Few can deny the empirical fact that most individuals, even in industrially advanced liberal democracies, led their lives within an inherited network of social attachments that could be described as community. According to Chatterjee, since the majority of the people in the post-colonial states do not have the basic material and cultural prerequisites of membership of civil society, they are denied the normative status of the virtuous citizen. Therefore, for them, communities are some of the most active agents of political practice. Chatterjee argues that unlike the trajectory of the democracy in the West, the notions of autonomy and representations are being claimed on behalf not only of individuals but of communities as well. And the politics of democratization is carried out not in civil society but in much less well-defined, legally ambiguous, contextually and strategically demarcated terrain of political society. Thus, to conclude, we have seen how Partha Chatterjee tries to explain how important political society is in maintaining democratic principles in the Indian context. We have seen that a large section of the urban poor who live in squatters have to fight for their rights, have to fight for their survival, not always through the constitutional ways. Sometimes they have to resort to extra legal ways, which are sometimes unlawful. But in doing so, they also create a patron-client kind of relationship with the ruling class and ensure that their interests are safeguarded. This particular class does not share the normative order of the ruling class and therefore is not hegemonized, but generally is put down through force and through domination. However, these squatter groups and these urban poor are the ones who resort to extra legal ways, and considering that India's economy 93% falls in the informal sector, one can assume that such a large chunk of population, at least a small portion of this, does constitute the political society in India. Thank you.